When the planet Mars has the highest degrees of any other planet in any sign, it's your Atmakaraka planet. The planet that is serving as the foundational blueprint for your basic character in this lifetime. And if Mars is your Atmakaraka, the first thing you should do is really study what Mars is from the inside out and what that force is doing within us. And you can start off with my series describing the Mars force of consciousness. So the first thing I say is learn as much as you can about Mars and then study what that force is to better understand yourself. And in this series, we're looking at what the sage Jaimini's statements about Mars are in his Jaimini Sutras. Sometimes his direct statements about the Mars, what the Mars Atmakaraka person is like, and other statements where Mars participates in certain combinations with other planets. And from those combinations, we can get clues about the Mars force and how that force will manifest in a person with a Mars Atmakaraka. So the first statement that Jaimini makes about Mars as the Atmakaraka directly is quote, a metallurgist, a spear fighter, and living by fire. So metallurgists are people who work with various types of metals and then combine them into useful tools. And so this can lead to various kinds of careers in the physical sciences when you work with raw materials that come from the earth. And I'll talk about that a lot more when I talk about the wealth from the earth, getting the wealth from the earth, because Mars rules the earth itself, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, some careers that involve Mars Atmakarakas that involve metallurgy are engineers who use metals and raw materials to build buildings, and architecture is involved in a Mars profession because architects, they have to have a very wide variety of knowledge about building materials, and they have to have also very strong spatial and logical intelligence, and those are both skills of Mars. So an architect is a very Martian career. Mars Atmakarakas can also be jewelers, people who work with gems or precious stones, working in oil extraction, any kind of mechanics. Mechanics is essentially different kinds of metals that either the tools or fixing things made out of metal. You have chemical engineers, electrical engineers, people who work in factories that build products, factory owners or factory workers, where you're building from raw materials. And of course, the classical career of a metallurgist being a blacksmith. The name Smith in the United States is a very common last name because blacksmiths were such a common career in the past. Every village had to have a blacksmith before mass production of metal-based products and then shipping them internationally. That became, a thing. So when you have, say, belts, nails, tools of any kind that you have to use to work on a farm, wagon wheels, there are so many things that use a kind of metal, and you would need that blacksmith to forge that metal into a form to then use. So that is kind of the heart of what a Mars profession would be like, working with metals, these resources from the earth, and then making them into a useful tool. And the deeper significance of a metallurgist is that these people utilize the wealth that is coming from under the earth, as I've mentioned, and Mars is the planet of raw territory and land. So Mars Atmakaraka people are learning this ability of discovering wealth that's hidden within themselves and then cultivating whatever wealth they find through effort and hard work. And that's an important part. It requires effort and hard work to take what's the riches within you and then utilize that in a productive way. The spiritual ability of Mars is discipline, to purify oneself, to remove anything that is harmful to you or impure within yourself and your character. And in the same way, in that same way, you see the physical manifestation of taking a raw mineral or resource from the earth, and you have to clean it and treat it or forge it to make it useful, like taking any kind of metal, and then you have to form it into the tool, and that requires an effort. So even if your land is bubbling up with oil, say you have land that's bubbling up with oil, and wow, I can make a fortune, you still have to build a system to extract that oil in an efficient way, and that requires all this kinds of specialized equipment, the brute force to pull out that oil, and then that oil has to be refined to make it useful. So spiritually, a Mars Atmakaraka person is being called towards this virtue of discipline and restraint in their passions, and then filtering instead filtering that passion into something productive and beneficial for oneself and for other people. And when Mars Atmakaraka people are struggling, what they're doing, struggling psychologically or in life, what they're doing is what they should be doing is working on discovering the hidden parts of themselves that are sometimes subconsciously or unconsciously, but you know, we can consciously ignore aspects of us that we don't want to change. But a lot of those things that we don't want to change, we bury them. And a Mars Atmakaraka person is really working to dig out those things buried within themselves and to really fight to uncover them. What's hidden within them, whether that's a hidden wealth or a hidden impurity. And essentially discovering what's lying beneath in their personalities and to make that hidden known and then transform it and to make it useful. So that is a very, that is the deeper layer of what the idea of a metallurgist is, this psychological and spiritual significance of that. And the next part of the phrase says Mars is a spear fighter. And in a little bit we're going to be talking about the weapon that Mars uses, which we discuss in this series about when Jaimini gives each planet a weapon. Mars is a spear. But here the symbolism when he's giving this first phrase, he adds spear fighter. And essentially that just means a person who, Mars Atmakaraka people are fighters. That means they can have a career in the armed forces, in the military, in a defensive type of force such as the police, and also people who are strategizing and making plans, and planning is an essential aspect of their work. And that could be someone who works in logistics and someone who deals in conflict resolution. And when you think about logistics, it's solving problems constantly over a territory. How do you move this in here and avoid that issue? And you're dealing with a system of problem solving. And Mars Atmakaraka people, they can be very combative in general. A fighter is someone who is combative, someone who is not really going to step down from a conflict. And a strong Mars is not going to be stepping down from a conflict, especially a Mars Atmakaraka person. And these people can run hot, as the saying goes, and they can be rather feisty and easily frustrated or rise into anger. They can have that aspect to them. And when you think about this utopian ideal of removing all war and that we can live in this society of world peace, well, it's essentially impossible, especially during the Kali Yuga, the era that we're in now, or arguably leaving, because conflict is just another aspect of earthly existence. And that's because of Mars. And for everyone to be able to get along all the time, have no conflict whatsoever, there would have to be no Mars vibration in our world. Mars enables us the ability to resolve conflicts. So a Mars Atmakaraka person is being called to understand and harness what the value of conflict is. Going through a conflict, a personal conflict, an interpersonal conflict, a career conflict, it can make you a better person. It should make you a better person. And there's a great value to overcoming them and to having to deal with them, and as we all have to. A person who lives a life with no conflicts is someone who's not going to be growing on all these different kinds of levels. So a Mars Atmakaraka person is being drawn, their attention is drawn into the fact that conflict can be a great thing once you know how to engage in it, and to learn how to fight for oneself and to fight and defend other people. So people have so many different motivations for choosing their professions, of course. And that goes the same with becoming a lawyer. And becoming a lawyer requires a combination of planets. Mercury has to be involved. But someone who chooses to become a lawyer in order to defend the rights of other people and to fight for other people, to enter into that conflict in the legal realm, is a person who is taking on that Mars perspective, who is approaching their career from the perspective of that Mars desire to combat and to engage in conflict. So a Mars Atmakaraka person in general has to understand that conflict is just another aspect of life. And they have to, it's an important aspect, but it's not avoidable, is a really key part. They have to learn how to deal, and they're going to be dealing in conflict a lot and learning how to harness better strategies in order to resolve conflicts, and to understand and to make Mars healthy. In dealing with those conflicts, a person needs to be as logical as possible during the conflict, and also to learn to be patient and to see and implement the most effective and efficient strategy possible so that you're not prolonging the conflict. There's so many different strategies that you can take in order to become better at that skill that Mars is in us. And the final phrase in this first statement that Jaimini gives a Mars Atmakaraka person, he says that they are living by fire. And this can mean many different professions, such as, of course, firefighters, electricians who are harnessing and controlling the fire element, which is electricity. Then you also have chefs or bakers who are working over a stove or working with an oven. And probably my favorite Mars profession is the ceramic artist. And a person's going to have other, again, a career is not just one planet doing one thing. It has to be usually accompanied by a lot of other planets in combination to give a really specific and detailed career, because we have so many different kinds of careers these days. But the Mars, back in the day when there's only a few careers, you just had to choose one path. A Mars Atmakaraka person would choose one of these more generalized fields. But anyway, to be a ceramic artist, you're going to have a little bit of Mercury, the 5th house, and Venus also involved in the chart in a specific way to help define that ceramics career. But a ceramic artist is using the wealth of the earth, the clay, the raw clay, and then using their hands to mold it into something. That would be the Mercury aspect, but then burning that clay in a kiln to solidify that form. And so they're directly using fire. They're living by the fire element. That's the key aspect of being a ceramic artist, knowing how to do a burn, a firing. And that's very technical. You don't just put the pot in the oven and then it comes out. There's a lot, they can break. There's a lot of technical aspects of doing it. So a Mars Atmakaraka person in general can be involved in that physical element of fire in some way in their profession. Metaphorically, living by fire means it shows that a Mars Atmakaraka person are very driven and they're very passionate people. So they're typically very determined and can be very forceful about what they want, and sometimes way too forceful. The unhealthy vice of Mars and an unhealthy Mars Atmakaraka is a person that misuses their personal willpower. And they become so wrapped up in their own passion and their attempt to mold the world in the way they envision it, that they disregard the willpower and the wills of other people. They want to change other people, or they want to force change on other people, and they would really want other people to see the way they see, and they'll try to force them to see the way they see at all costs. And again, to force change upon the world that becomes destructive rather than constructive. We all can work together as a team to resolve problems and move forward. When your willpower is you're overtaken by your own willpower, you become a destructive force because you're disregarding the wills of other people. That's the problem with magic. Magic is basically the extension of your willpower onto other people, and doing it for the sake of getting what you want, and then using techniques to get what you want. And Mars Atmakaraka people, they can be very stubborn in all of this and their desires to change other people, rather than focusing in and use Mars in a healthy way to change themselves. And when they can't change other people effectively, it can result in heavy frustration and heavy anger, which are the two quintessential emotions of Mars. And I use the example of Aleister Crowley. He has his most famous quotation is, "Do what thou wilt, and that will be the whole of the law." And that perfectly illustrates the will to power. Do what thou wilt, and that's the most important thing, basically. And that is Mars. That's pure Mars, exerting one's own power. And that is very unhealthy, and it becomes this forceful and domineering mentality because you're disregarding other people's wills, and that's the problem with magic. But the healthy Mars Atmakaraka is someone who is learning how to curtail their willpower and in respect for the power of other people. So they're able to control the fire within, not to let it burn too hot, and they're very strategic about it. And they are really good at choosing their battles, which means choosing the right battles, knowing when it's worth it to fight, when it's not worth it to fight. A person who has an unhealthy Mars Atmakaraka is a person that becomes so exhausted because they're always fighting in some way, shape, or form. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, about the thirst of Mars, the hunger and thirst of Mars, and the problem with being unable to quench that thirst, which results in a person who's burning themselves out, essentially. So the next characterization of Mars by Jaimini is that when Mars is 4 signs from the Atmakaraka in the 9th divisional chart, the Navamsha, or in the 16th divisional chart or the 24th divisional chart, so you have the Atmakaraka and then Mars is 4 signs away. And in this system, if it's an even sign, you count in reverse. That's just a side note. But we get Jaimini's description if Mars is in that position, and then we can use that description as a way to understand Mars on a deeper level. We get a clue of what Mars is. And this position symbolically shows the emotional nature of a person and what the emotional nature of what Mars is. So Jaimini says that in the 4th from the Atmakaraka, the person, if Mars is there, the person will live in a house made of brick. So bricks are, of course, created in a furnace, and they are the result of earth being solidified by the fire, how a ceramic artist works, or any kind of, there are massive factories where it's basically giant ovens and they create clay bricks and tiling for the roofs of houses. So made of brick. Bricks are hard, they're sturdy, they're square usually. They can be in other shapes and forms, but in this sense it's an object that doesn't readily move around. It's sturdy and stable. So this shows the emotional nature of a Mars Atmakaraka person, being that they can be very hardened and guarded emotionally. And they don't flow so easily between the various emotional states, but they can be in one emotional frame of mind, and they'll be in one emotional frame of mind for a lot longer. They're harder to move out of that. And so it can be challenging for them to change the opinions of a Mars Atmakaraka person. They're not easily swayed. It takes a lot to change them, to change their understanding of what they're feeling. That's not necessarily negative. You could have and that is a very big part about what Mars is. It's a very convicted, they're convinced, they have a strong convictions, which gives them strong opinions. And that's not necessarily negative. You have to that can be a very great thing. Made of brick means that it's harder to convince them. They're gonna really need a lot of good arguments or good rationale for why they should change their conviction. And as I mentioned a little earlier, Mars Atmakaraka people can be very stubborn in the sense that what they feel, and they're not as interested in hearing about how other people tell them they should feel or about a situation. They want you to acknowledge their position and then validate their position, and they're not going to be as open to ask you, oh, how should I change this? Or what should I do? They're not as open in that way. They can be very, very firm emotionally about what they feel, and they want you to respect that. So in other words, they're more likely to really dig in about how they're feeling, and they're going to logically justify it in a very strong way. When you see a Mars Atmakaraka person developing in a healthy direction, you see them becoming more flexible and dynamic in allowing their emotions to move within them and throughout them, rather than hardening themselves to the outside world, like becoming an immovable brick. And in Vedic astrology, Mars behaves like the planet Ketu, the south node. And they're very similar because Ketu is a very insulating force. It tightens up, and it helps a person spiritually evolve because it brings the focus in on one's internal nature. When Mars is unhealthy, it can take on a certain negative and difficult and not cruel, but an aspect where you become damaged by becoming too insulated in yourself. It becomes a kind of toxic habit when a person is not able to flow emotionally, but they keep getting tighter and tighter in, like a hardening of a brick during that firing process. So that can be a negative aspect of the Mars Atmakaraka emotional worldview. And what I've noticed about Mars Atmakaraka people is that they have this kind of natural resiliency and strength in their emotional makeup, similar to how we were talking about the sun's emotional nature. But an aspect of so they have a resilience, but they're not as, in the way, self-sufficient, that a way a sun would be. But they can be very argumentative and brash in the way that they're treating other people. But to them, the Mars Atmakaraka person, they see this as a positive because they were trying to be as protective as possible. And they want to be, and they can be very hardened towards their desire to not beat around the bush, to do what needs to be done in a certain situation to avoid a certain threat. And they can be very quick to anger, and that anger has a purpose, and that is to prevent the problem from getting out of control, or to show, say if you're angry at another person, to show them that what they're doing they shouldn't be doing for whatever reason you have. So there's a logic to anger. It's not just this irrational thing. Emotions have logic to them. And when a Mars Atmakaraka person is using their anger productively, it can be very positive, even if people may not like them. Oh, he's a jerk. Okay, yeah, but he got the job done, you know? And in the military, that's a very important thing, is when you're dealing with life and death, like in a war, you have to get the job done, and you can't just it's not the time for kind words. So there's a way to productively use anger and to use that high energy, Mars, blunt force kind of way of moving through the world, and it helps to solve problems quicker. And so you can move on to the next thing, and life can become more efficient if you know how to use anger in the right way. And a Mars Atmakaraka person is learning how to use these positive qualities that can be positive about how to use their conflict resolution and ability to use anger in a productive way. But the negative side of a Mars Atmakaraka person in this respect, in this emotional respect, is the state of feeling this constant hunger for more, to do more, to climb higher, to chase an experience, to be always trying to fix some kind of problem or issue in their life. And that drive and that hunger becomes very exhausting, and the person becomes chronically dissatisfied, that sensation of it's not enough, and nothing is ever completed or nothing is ever good enough. It needs to be better. And that, again, it just leads to more frustration and more pushing forward. So that is the side when Mars becomes toxic, and Mars becomes an emotional burden on the person, if it's their Atmakaraka, that thirst and hunger for more. So what they're learning, what a Mars Atmakaraka person is learning is like I said, what conflicts are they choosing are the conflicts that they're going to try to resolve and fix, and whether they're working on fixing themselves or too focused on fixing other people. But in the deeper level, it's learning how to become satisfied, to have that thirst quenched, and to have that satiation after eating a good meal, their hunger resolved. The unhealthy Mars is always wanting, well, you could think about it like when the Mars Atmakaraka is unhealthy, it feels like they're walking through a desert all the time, looking for water. So they're looking for something to quench their thirst, and they're looking for something that is going to make them feel satisfied, but it's a desert, so water is very rare, or it's unavailable at all. So life feels like this constant search for water in a desert. They can't find satisfaction in a true and deep way where they feel calm. And so until they learn what they can do in life to quench that thirst and how to tone down that passion and desire for more and more and more, they're going to always be feeling like they're wandering through a waterless desert, and they're going to struggle and they're always going to have the struggle with feeling truly satisfied, to really take the moment in and find true content. A healthy Mars is able to be contented after that fire to resolve something or the fire to get something, that thirst for more. They can then find a way to, okay, I'm content. I don't have to keep pushing. But the unhealthy Mars is always has that drive, that insatiable quench for something more, and it becomes very exhausting if you're not able to satisfy that. Whenever I talk about this, I just think of a cold glass of water. Oh, wow, that's so good. After you drink that cold glass of water on a hot day, you're not in a driving state of mind. But if you're going through a hot day and you never get that glass of water, you just become exhausted. Take that metaphor outwards, and that's how a Mars Atmakaraka person unhealthily is moving through the world, is that they struggle to calm themselves down and to calm that drive down for more and more and more. So when we get to the weapon of Mars, we're told by Jaimini that a Mars Atmakaraka person is one armed with a spear. So spears are very effective weapons of combat because they have such a long reach to them. The tip of the spear is able to strike at a much longer distance than a sword, the sun's sword. You can also throw a spear, and a spear you could also include, say, a bow and arrow, the arrow being able to launch at a long distance. Strategically, it's a great weapon in the olden times, and today a spear, one armed with a spear, would be one armed with a gun. You can hit the opponent from a distance. It's a very immediately effective weapon. So this shows that a Mars Atmakaraka person does what needs to get done in a conflict situation. They may not fight fair, and they will do anything that it takes to win. So a gun or a spear, it comes down to that raw, brutal ability to win the battle. Honor is kind of thrown out the window. When it comes to life and death, you can't be making arguments, oh, that wasn't fair. It's life and death. And when it's life and death, you have to do what you have to do to survive. And Mars Atmakaraka, and so outside of just the violent nature of what I'm talking about, take this, use this in a sense of how you in your daily life would be going about, not just in a violent confrontation. But Mars Atmakaraka people are very competitive in general, and they have a very strong desire to win, sometimes at any cost. And that can make them seem kind of brutal, and especially mostly when they feel threatened or if they're in a mood to fight. And also relentless. If you get a strong Mars Atmakaraka person fired up, they will they'll take the fight very seriously. They're very competitive, and their will to win can be very strong within them. And this is not saying that they're inherently violent people, of course. And all athletes need to have strong Mars because it's that will to win. It's that will to beat the opponent. And the psychological tendency of a Mars Atmakaraka person is to be able to conquer the obstacle and defeat an opponent, say in debate, in as logical way as possible. And sometimes they have to use cunning or under-the-table tactics, such as being manipulative or deceitful, if that means they can get the upper hand. And sometimes that is the most effective way of winning a battle. And in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, he says one of the keys of winning, in any case, if you want to win a war, are secret agents. Having the right secret agents, and it basically means having an intelligence of the enemy on their inside. And that's a very cunning thing to do, but it's the most effective way to win. So a person with the Mars Atmakaraka, they'll be very tempted by these underhanded ways of winning when the competition is on the line, so to say. And playing within the rules can be a challenge, and they'll sometimes want to break or bend the rules because they want to get that upper hand no matter what. And I've seen Mars Atmakaraka people, if they're not really, they're not all ruthless people, but they're going to be competitive in one area of their life specifically, very driven to be better, and they want that praise, they want that satisfaction of having won. So there's usually an area in their life where they're very, very competitive about. And the healthy Mars Atmakaraka person using the spear as their weapon during conflict is someone who is as efficient as possible in resolving the problem. So in a debate, Mars actually makes a person a good debater if it's connected to the third house of communications, and oftentimes the second house as well, second house, the voice. But Mars is the debating planet, and in a debate or an argument with another person, you want to really use as few words as possible to get to the direct point you're trying to make in the most effective and simplistic logical way in order to win that debate. So no meandering around the point, no long stories that help bring in a little bit of color. No, the emphasis is that spear striking at the heart of the issue in order to resolve it quickly, in order to this is it, period. And usually, like I said, that means being very blunt. And a way I like to think about a nice, healthy Mars is a person that's able to take on that less is more aesthetic, or that less is more way of going about, say in this case, an argument, because you're not wasting time and energy on secondary or periphery issues. You're just getting to the raw problem and dealing with it quickly. And that less is more kind of way of living life is you can do more, learning how to do more with less. And that is a way to really expand your strength. You don't need so many things to get a certain job done. And that is a very great way to resolving conflicts, when you just have the certain tools in the tool belt, and that is going to get you where you need to go. And you don't need, it's learning how to not beat around the bush, being blunt, but also not bringing in excessive things that you might need one day, or these arguments. No, you just want to get right to the heart of something, to attack the problem head on. And that is what the strength of Mars using a spear would be, to get at that point, that exact point, to make the problem go away, or to deal a deadly strike or a very effective strike in an opponent to to debilitate their position. And the final description that Jaimini gives us about the Mars Atmakaraka person pertains to the kind of spiritual path these people are following. And he says they are a Nyayiika, excuse my pronunciation, it's Nyayiika, I think is how you pronounce it. But the Nyaya philosophy is what it is. It's a person who practices this philosophy. This philosophy, one of the branches of Vedic philosophy, is the systematic and logical means of gaining knowledge. And to understand it really simply is, and why a Mars Atmakaraka person is this kind of pursuant of spiritual wisdom, is that each planet is ruling an element. The 5 starry planets, excluding the sun and moon, the other 5 planets, they rule an element, and Mars rules fire. Fire brings light, and our perception of light, and our eyes are what we use to perceive changes in light. So Mars is the planet that rules over our eyes and our eyesight. Nyaya philosophy is about deciphering what we can see and perceive logically in the world around us, and then deriving truth from it. That's simple. So it's about being logically correct. It's a very scientific approach to truth that relies on direct realism in its argumentation about truth and the world. So it's also a very debate-orientated way of discovering the truth, of juxtaposing certain ideas and juxtaposing one from another, and then removing what is ever false by juxtaposing them together and finding those defective lines of logical reasoning. So very Martian way of examining the truth. And this is a very scientific mode of learning from the world. So all of this points to the Mars Atmakaraka ability, the Mars Atmakaraka person ability, being very logically orientated, very rational, learning how to become more rational, and being able to use the logical faculties in a very in a way that builds wisdom and builds knowledge. And so practical reasoning is really important. And it's not so much as a bird's eye view philosophical, like the way Jupiter would do, where you create this big view of the world, create a belief system, and then you are able to act according to your principles based on those beliefs. Mars Atmakaraka way of approaching it is more on the ground. It's true or false. It's practical in how the world should be working and is working. And that's why Mars Atmakaraka people can do very well in the natural sciences and engineering and physics, anything mechanical, and being debaters is because they're using mathematical disciplines. It's either true or false. Something is either working or it's not working, and there's not much room for gray area, so to say. So Mars Atmakaraka people will want certainty and obvious answers to things. They want that clear truth, the way that what my eyes can see, I know it's true because I can see it. But a weak Mars Atmakaraka person, what they're going to be is they're not going to be as tight in their reasoning, and they will make assumptions or build rationales on things that they're maybe actually not so sure about. They're not as concrete, I know this is true, I've proven it. And it can make them make easier mistakes if they're not very certain, or if they're if the planets, if Mars is weak, they'll have like, oh, I'm just kind of assuming that's true, but I haven't found that out for myself. So a Mars Atmakaraka, a healthy one, is able to dissect details on why something works or something doesn't work. But the unhealthy Mars Atmakaraka is going to be overlooking details that end up being very important. You can't build a bridge or be an engineer without knowing every single detail and having everything worked out structurally, logically. It puts lives at stake. It's very important. It's a life and death situation. So when a Mars Atmakaraka person, they have a healthy Mars within them, they're able to retain every logical detail and understand how to build an argument from the bottom up and having no chinks in the armor, so to say. So in conclusion, the Mars Atmakaraka people, they're metallurgists and they're living by fire. And they do their best in professions that work with fire in some form. And that could be a chef, a firefighter in the armed services, in defense professions, a police, a lawyer, and working with raw minerals from the earth directly. And I didn't say it earlier, but this also includes working in real estate. You're working with territories and you're working with the foundation of where a person lives and where a person's territory will eventually be. You're dealing in territories, and Mars is the planet of the earth and territories. Mars's emotional nature is made of brick, so they can be very stubborn at times, difficult to change their opinions on things, very opinionated in general, and very solid and unmoving in their convictions about how they feel. And it's more difficult to convince them of something other than what they're personally feeling. And they can be very guarded and protected about their emotional world, as a brick house is very strong and sturdy against the elements or against enemies. So there's a value to being guarded emotionally. It's a survival tactic, so it's not necessarily a negative thing, but they can be very guarded and emotionally. They can have an emotional strength and resiliency to them, but they can also be difficult to change and difficult to help them to open up and be more fluid in their emotions. So that's something that they have a challenge in their lives. Mars as a planet uses the spear, so that means they can be very versatile when it comes to defending their logic and resolving problems. They have there's a variety of ways that they can attack a person, and they're going to be very adamant and competitive in their striving to win at any cost. And when Mars is unhealthy, this can make them even very ruthless and manipulative and cunning to get what they want, to get what their heart is desiring and burning to have. And at worst, this means that the ends will justify the means for these people, and their will to power, to gain power, and their own willpower to defeat other people makes them domineering and dangerous if they're not understanding that they have to respect the willpower of others. So there's an intensity to all of that. And on the healthy side, this doesn't just mean they're great fighters and know how to win, but also that they're way less willing to give up on a fight, and they'll fight for longer, especially when the obstacle becomes very difficult. When things become very bleak, they're still willing to able to push on and make the best out of the situation, still with that glimmer of hope that they can somehow win. But they're very driven to make the best out of a conflict, even when they're losing, so they don't give up easily on something. And Mars Atmakaraka people are drawn to the Nyaya philosophy, which is a very practical, rational, scientific, and realistic form of gathering knowledge about the world from what we can see. So this makes them great scientists and students of the natural world in general. They can be great lovers of nature because nature is not going to be lying to you. There's no lie in nature. And it's a very logical system. And so they can do well in any kind of field that wants to look at what we see in nature and understand it. And how everything is logically built up into a system that makes sense on every level. It's us human beings that tend to confuse things, but when you just look out into the world, you see everything in a certain kind of harmony, despite the brutality of what the natural world can be at times. It's very structured, it's very true. And these people, they do well they're stimulated by understanding how things work, and they don't do as well in relishing in mysteries. That's something that I like to tell people. Sometimes you just have to put something down and relish the mystery and just say, okay, it's we're never going to know, and that's okay. But the Mars Atmakaraka person, they really want to solve mysteries. They really want to get to the truth of something very, very adamantly. And even if they're not meant to know the truth about something, they will do their best to try to find it. And that's one of the problems with science, is that, and Mars is very scientific, as I've been explaining, is that they think they can find the truth of everything through what you can see. And that can be a Mars failure, because some things we can't see, some things are hidden, they're occulted. And we're not going to know in every aspect of how reality works on every level using the techniques of finding information just from what you can see, the scientific method. There's more out there. Mars Atmakaraka person does better when they're able to surrender to a mystery, not try to solve every mystery by just trying to solve it using the tools of science, by using the tools of logic based on things that you can see and measure. So there's a limitation to that a Mars Atmakaraka person has to learn. There are limitations on that. What you can see is not the end, essentially. But the Mars Atmakaraka emphasis on logic and rationality is extremely useful in most real world contexts outside of, again, say the mysteries of spirituality and having to learn to submit to a higher power. That is not really a Mars, they're not really satisfied with that. But the phrase that I like to use that sums up Mars very well is that conflict is the ocean that we swim in on Earth. And so being able to understand that conflict is an everyday part of our lives, and being able to harness the ability to make conflicts productive and use conflicts very rationally to resolve them quickly and efficiently is one of the major callings of Mars people in this lifetime, to be able to embrace the conflict, to not be overburdened by it, just realize that it's an aspect of life that we all have to deal with, and just become better at it. And that's what the Mars force in us is doing within all of us. But the Mars Atmakaraka person in this lifetime, their focus is going to be heavy on learning how to get better at that part of the game of life. Okay, stay tuned for the next video, which will be the Atmakaraka Mercury.